Hello everyone, today we talk about the Principality of Galicia after having looked at its future, that is the Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia. This is the before from the Slavic migrations. The polity is also known as the Principality of Alich, from which the name of Galicia comes from, also the Principality of the Halician Rus, where of course in Eastern Slavic lands, in Ruthenia, the Principality of Galicia emerging as a very important provincial reality within the regional Kievan Rus. The principality was founded by some of the oldest blood in Ruthenia, tracing back to Yaroslav the Wise. We will see it now as just a little introduction. There is a specific character of the Galician Principality as far as the usually heard, historiographically wise notion that before, especially the Mongol invasions, the Kievan Rus would have had an important dialectic between the princes and the, let's say, the citizens. It's a big word for Eastern Europe, let's say the freemen, mostly the mercantile estates of the important, in fact, hilltops and trade centers on the great Ruthenian riverways. These are, in fact, the lands in which the post-Mongol autocracy that already existed, in fact, at the root of Eastern European powers in the same Eastern Slavs at large, would take less root, because there was a stronger balance between the nobility and the people that were able thus to negotiate antagonistically, dialectically, conflictually, to maintain an important solidity of their polities. We still haven't made enough videos about the entirety of the Rus to show how, for example, the more north and east you go and the more messed up, underdeveloped and sort of terrified the situation really is. That is actually what would eventually trigger the Mongol style, like Muscovite expansion, except the southern lands were also more exposed to the, in fact, steppes powers, at least until Mongols arrived. Wasn't much of a problem. Besides, as you know, the Ruthenian Palatinate was also exposed to Poland and Hungary. It's a bit the leitmotif of today's video, because this was in fact the westernmost part of the Rus, and especially during the later troubles, especially of the 13th century, the neighboring powers tried to in fact assert a degree of protection that on the Galician Principality that we have observed, in fact, better also in the Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, the Uniate Church, the connections with Rome, and all what was really needed to seek that help, that support. Now, Alich was established as the main center of the Principality around 1124. These were, again, broad administrative centers in areas that had, overall, compared to the rest of Europe, like a scarce population density, difficult connections. There were lots of forests, swamps. Communications were greatly favored by, again, the great riverways, over which most of these hilltops, in fact, were established, allowing for the accumulation of surplus from trade and more. Hence, the dichotomy between the princely rule that was more authoritarian and say that the mercantile one was more popular. We will see now better all these various princes in their succession. You know how the Ruthenian seigniorate work was very similar to the Polish one. I even made a video explaining, in fact, how similar these countries were. In fact, parts of Galicia are today properly Central European in nature. You know that some parts of historical Galicia are part of today's Poland. In the southeast, made other videos about Ukrainian history of Galicia-Volhynia and the issues that arose there in the 20th century. This is, of course, far away in time, but there was a lot of competition between these various rulers that at large tended to collect as many principalities as possible being often overthrown from one another. There is this interesting cross history with Poland as well. So when we look at the Eastern Slavs back in the old days, right, there were different groups within what would become essentially the Kievan Rus in a broader political and territorial way. And in this specific area, we're looking at the so-called Red Ruthenians that had established various principalities, including the one of Peremysl and one of Belz. The White Croats and the Dulebs inhabiting these lands. We'll talk more about these people another time. If anything, we partially addressed the Croat matter in the video about the Duchy of Croatia. In any case, these centers were known as the Cherben, that is the red cities, creating a provincial cradle on its own within the Rus. In 907, the Croat and Duleb tribes, under the leadership of the Prince Oleg of Kiev, to a military expedition against Constantinople. This is famously recorded by the Ruthenian Primary Chronicle. We talked about this in Byzantine history videos as well. It's pretty famous. I have a series about Eurasian steppes warfare in which we observed the various political and strategic capacities of projection that Kiev and the subjected principalities had. This expedition was significant as essentially the Ruthenians brought their force into Thrace and began to pressure Constantinople to the point of a peace that was negotiated between the two, and displaying the Kievan leverage of power. As you understand also from a geographical perspective, yes, Kiev was better located on the Dnipro with a bigger center, the straighter riverway to mount up expeditions into the Black Sea. However, from a geographical point of view, Red Ruthenia was closer to the Danube Delta, and so that was fundamentally the border with the empire. There would be, in fact, many powers sort of overlapping there. You have the Cumans, you have the Hungarians, you have the Byzantines, you have the Red Ruthenians, and different groups also within the same, as we will see today, mostly struggling for the control over the major Black Sea ports at the end of the valleys leading south. It's important to observe how the Red Ruthenians were already well connected with Kiev from the beginning of the 10th century, as showed by Oleg's expedition. Nestor the chronicler, living between the mid-11th and the early 12th century, tells us that several fortifications in the western part of Red Ruthenia were captured at this point by Volodymyr the Great, that had historically been, in fact, the boss of the situation. He had been Prince of Novgorod from 970, then Grand Prince of Kiev from 978 until his death in 1015. He is famously later canonized as Saint Volodymyr by the Eastern Orthodox Church. This event, the invasion, essentially Kievan invasion of this western Red Ruthenian territories, occurs in 981. This begins the affirmation of a more solid power in the area. It would also decentralize at a point from the same Kiev. However, in a process, as you know, further principalization of quasi-feudalization of the same Rus the more the time progresses, because this is a very early time, right? It's still a phase in which the local communities are transitioning from a tribal into a more dynastic profile, and it's very gradual, especially in Eastern Europe. On top of these territorial acquisitions, Volodymyr launched a military expedition against the Croats in 992 and 993, which expands further west. During this time, the city of Volodymyr was founded in honor of the Grand Prince of Kiev, becoming the main center of political power in this area. Right. Interestingly enough, the center today is now a small city in Volyn Oblast, northwestern Ukraine. But we're talking, in fact, medieval times, and of course, times passed ever since. Throughout the 11th century, the western frontier centers included Przemysl, that, as you know, is in today's Poland, as it started being annexed by that kingdom as early as intermittently from 1018 to 1031 and from 1069 to 1080. However, Przemysl would remain Ruthenian for a long time. This shows you already how the local Polish dukes did have like an interest in a southeastward expansion, even though these were among the least developed areas, in fact, of Poland, that mostly had to take care of other issues elsewhere. At the same time, Yaroslav the Wise, Grand Prince of Kiev from 1019 until his death in 1054, reinforced the Kievan presence in Red Ruthenia by founding the city of Yaroslav along the San River. So you understand, this is typical of the high medieval revivals in Eastern Europe, the foundation of new towns, their fortification, different expansion, more sort of regional outlook at the world. In fact, if you look at this from the side of the Kievan Rus that is battling evenly with Poland over the resources of that frontier, these towns are founded in what would become, in fact, the southern part of the Volhynian Principality. In fact, the same Volodymyr is known as Volodymyr Volynsky. Right? You can check in some of the maps here, and you can check especially the video made about the kingdom of Galicia Volhynia. Around 1085, with the support from the Grand Prince Vsevolod I of Kiev, who reigned from 1078 until his death in 1094, the three noble Rostislavich brothers, that were the children of Rostislav Vladimirovich of Tmutarakan, set up their settlement. Essentially, three sub-principalities were established as an appanage for these princes that should have guarded the western frontier. If anything, we may talk about them because, albeit smaller, they are sort of cohesive principalities, or at least they are established with this same function and they remain, of course, very tied to one another. That are the ones, in fact, of Przemysl, Zvenyorod, and Terebovlia. On October the 19th, 1097, the Terebovlia Principality was established at the Council of Lubach after enduring several years of civil war involving Vasilko Rostislavich, who vied for the succession of Chernihiv. What is important here is realizing that these princes, the life of which is a bit difficult to follow if you are making, like in this case, just a local history or regional history of a particular polity, were actually in possession of many different principalities across the Rus, tendentially gravitating around the southern part that was, as we explained, more rich and important. The Council of Lubach is quite relevant because it fully affirms like the territorial physiognomy of these principalities. Vasilko Rostislavich, that we just mentioned here, roughly 1066-1124, who was recognized as the first prince, the inaugural prince of Terebov from 1092. By the way, this guy was taken out the Byzantine way, which was not really that frequent among the Ruthenians. That is, by being blinded and essentially recluded. This is fascinating because, you know, Ruthenia at this point it has major infights, but it does maintain some specific Slavic traditions, and in part the autocratic tendencies of some rulers bring to some karma or at least an imitation of Byzantine policies. The tension there was inherently between this greater imitation of Constantinople or following some that was also more autocratic, more princely, more hierarchical, more authoritative in nature, and the autonomy of other various rulers. In the year 1124, Ihor Vasilkovich was granted the Principality of Galicia as a minor province by his father, Vasilko, the Prince of Terabovlia. This division separated Galicia from the larger Terabovlia Principality. It's important because it enucleates it further, as you understand. The former had been established around 1084, as we've seen, as an appanage for the same Vasilko Rostislavich, that could thus also dispose of it in a dynastic sense, as it was better seen. The Rostislavich brothers gradually autonomized themselves politically from Volodymyr, but also successfully defended against external threats, thanks to the local expansion, the capacity to further entrench a power in these various Galician towns. For example, in 1099, the Rostislavich brothers defeated an army of the same Grand Prince of Kiev, Sviatopolk II, at the Battle of the Rozhne Plain. In the same 1099, the Rostislavich brothers defeated the Hungarian army of King Koloman near Przemysl as well, demonstrating that this Red Ruthenian principality was on the rise. The Galicians essentially made this major international stand by crushing both Kievan and the Hungarian forces. This is a measure of their power. Actually, these victories, especially scored with such confidence, naturally the Hungarians had intervened because they said that now after the victory over the Kievans, this Reds will be exhausted. Instead, he got crushed himself, right? And they corresponded to, in fact, a great power that allowed for almost a century of relative peace and development in Galicia, reinforcing further the solidity of this dynastic principality. The four sons of the Rostislavich brothers divided the territory into 4 regions. This was really the practice at the time because essentially the more north and east you go, and in Europe the less the later at least the practice of seniority in terms of inheritance mostly concentrated in the hands of the firstborn son occurs. This implicitly shows how limited the nobility was compared to other parts of Europe, especially towards the people that had, in fact, something to say. They wanted to have a more split autocratic rule. That's why, again, Galicia is so important, because it was not even less developed than the other places, so that normally happens also in areas that have less power. Instead, this is the case as well. We'll see now the intervention of the freemen also in this princely rule. The quadripartition occurred on the basis of the most important centers. Przemysl was managed by Rostislav. Zvenyorod was led by Volodymyrko. Halich and Terabovlia were governed respectively by Ivan and Yuri. After the deaths of 3 of these brothers, the last standing, Volodymyrko of Galicia, consolidated, reunited Galician power by taking control of Przemysl and Halich itself. He, however, also assigned Zvenyorod to Ivan, that was his nephew, from the elder brother Rostislav. Horod, it's just the suffix for fortress. So imagine just even how these places could be at the time, and of course how, a seigneury always started from these fortified hilltops. In 1141, Volodymyrko moved his residence from Przemysl to Alich itself. It was increasingly rising in importance. In fact, controlling it conferred a strategic centrality in the control of the Galician Principality. Volodymyrko was essentially the sole ruler. Even his nephew was a subordinate. In 1145, he went away from Red Ruthenia, because again, these guys, we're skipping that side of the story, but they were going around across the Kievan Rus. And on this occasion, the freemen of Alich elect as their own leader Ivan of Zvenigorod to reign over them. This may sound just as a familial power sharing, but it was actually a veritable usurpation, because Volodymyrko was essentially ousted by that move, and Ivan was to retain his power. But the matter was not solved without a fight. In fact, Ivan was defeated under the walls of the same Alich that had resisted him, and with his demise, the same Zvenigorod that his uncle, as we've seen, had provided to him was incorporated into the broader Galician Principality. So Volodymyrko stood alone, right? His entire siblings and potential as relative offspring were taken out, which also posed him in an interesting international relationship, because now Galicia was quite consistent. It was a solid province in the larger, let's say, English sense of the term, even managing to absorb other towns previously belonging to the Grand Prince of Kiev, at least in a general ultimate sense, yet managing to preserve them in spite of the antagonism that at that point was rising with the same Kiev. For example, during the rule of Grand Prince Yaroslav II, who reigned between 1146 to 1154. Think about the same years. 1154 is the date of Frederick Barbarossa's rise as King of Germany. From the other side of the Carpathians, so in a much more warring sense, there is also the famous King Jedza II of Hungary, which of course is very interested in what is happening in Red Ruthenia. As we've seen, the Hungarians had very strong ambitions towards their territory. We saw it also in the video about the Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, in the one about Moldavia. Poland was always there, looming as well. Volodymyrko died in 1152. He had a son, right? So this Galician Principality continued with him, Yaroslav Osmomysl. He was at that point like the Kniaz proper of Alich, which is a sort of subtitle. It can be translated. There is no translation actually in other languages. There are equivalents. It can be duke, king, or in a sense some sort of lord of the city. So this was intended primarily as the local ruler of the town that also becomes the broader prince. That's how we call of Galicia. From there, as we've seen, this was the heart of the Galician Principality, where the relative throne stood. Yaroslav was militarily active. He, for example, fought at the battle on the river Siret against the Grand Prince of Kiev, Iziaslav, who manages to inflict heavy losses on the Galicians. This battle happens in 1153, from which you realize that since Iziaslav died the following year, the Kievan prince was not able to capitalize on this victory over the Red Ruthenians, which allows Yaroslav to get away with this defeat and maintain his power. In fact, for a while, the eastern frontier of Red Ruthenia was a bit more secure. This, by the way, allowed the same Yaroslav to negotiate from a condition of maintained strength with Hungary and Poland, that as always were looking at Red Ruthenia and saying, okay, the Kievans are invading this, so let's now take advantage of it. Instead, in spite of the Galician defeat, Yaroslav's power remained more or less intact and allowed for no takeover. After some years and further diplomatic interaction, Yaroslav even managed to take out his main rival, that was Ivan, the eldest of the Rostislavich descendants and former prince of Zvenyorod, who had survived the Battle of Alich. Yaroslav, just like his father, enhanced the Principality of Galicia through international relations and providing the centers of his dominion with an important series of infrastructures. He founded monasteries that were very important. Also, as a broader patrimonial strategy, he erected different buildings serving the local trade. He extended his governance also, just like his father, to over the territories surrounding the lower courses of the Dynastic, Prut, and Danube rivers. In other words, he started heading towards the Black Sea and reaching, in fact, those areas that were actually a bit more difficultly accessible because these were wilder lands, as you know, they were populated by the Cumans, they were marshy grounds, etc., but seizing control of specific strongholds at the mouth of these rivers on the Black Sea was what basically the Rus had always done. Just mostly the nomads did not have many chances to recover those territories. There wasn't really any power around that could have the upper hand on these ports. So it was very advantageous, especially in this time of great expansion, we're in the second half of the 12th century, to maintain control on those crucial hubs of international trade. And Galicia controlled, as you understand from these three valleys, actually a pretty sizable amount of trade volume. Around 1157, the Assumption Cathedral was built in Alich. This was very relevant because its rival of Saint Sophia in Kiev that had been shortly built, also in turn inspired, of course, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. So Alich was one of the important Ruthenian principalities, provided with its own spiritual, political, military center. In fact, the city expanded to a significant perimeter encompassing essentially 100 square kilometers. You have to imagine multiple layers of walls around the hilltop. It's really in the typical, Eastern Slavic fashion. Despite this strong international position, Yaroslav had to mitigate his own power on request of the local freemen. Right? This is what we were talking about before. When you realize that even these noble princes were subject to the general sort of judgment of the local communities that had a say even in matters of matrimonial, patrimonial policies concerning the same prince. Yaroslav had, in fact, to consider the people, even as far as his personal preferences towards these policies were concerned. Of course, we're not talking about the average shoemaker. We're talking about some more affluent individuals in the city that, of course, controlled the river traffics, that had a robust power that controlled the local trade, had a significant leverage on, in fact, also masses of armed troops. I made some video about, again, Kievan, Ruthenian warfare at this point, including one exactly about the militia, the infantrymen. All right. If anything, I have to re-upload it with better pictures, but there I have some fitting information for this. This is interesting because, as you know, Eastern Europe does not sort of spark for particular sort of communal autonomies, but in these areas of the Rus, there is something comparable to other, especially Central European. There is a very strong, not just proximity from a spatial point of view, but in a broader cultural sense in pre-Mongol, especially southwestern Ruthenia with Central Europe. They were very similar, especially with Poland. Remember that the Slavs were a fresh people. These were also pretty affluent. So when you imagine these battles we just described, always remember that the Kievan Rus had a hell of a cavalry with very, very impressive characteristics, also compared to Western knights that, however, largely attracted the Ruthenian interest as far as their panoply was concerned. There were lots of imports, especially from Germany, of arms and armor to Kiev. But there is an infantry as well, an infantry that we described and will keep describing, also very capable to cope with horse archery from the steppes that, again, had historically taken on even Byzantine forces, had been able to stand their ground against the Hungarians. So substantial forces, even for relatively small spaces like these, like Galicia can be at large, that does not have to be underestimated. By the way, there was a great deal of Byzantine connection with the broader political and international posture of Galicia. In fact, roughly around this time, and I made a video about the reign of Manuel I Comnenus, was about a great peak of Byzantine expansion in the 12th century before the capture of Constantinople by the Crusaders at the beginning of the following one. That, in fact, witnessed to integrate the Ruthenian principalities into the broader imperial strategy that at that point Manuel was enacting against Hungary. Right? The Magyars had always been a pain in the behind for the Byzantines that, however, at this point gained the upper hand and managed to expand and to crush also the Hungarians in open field and reassert imperial control on the Danubian area. Part of this is achieved with Galician forces. Volodymirko himself was viewed as an hippos pondus, that is essentially a vassal, a subject of the same Manuel Comnenus. Of course, you could take these subordinate roles, knowing that it's not like the Byzantines are going to invade Halych. They also don't care. They have other more immediate issues. But initially, there are some issues with the same Constantinople, especially as far as the Byzantine presence is felt in the Black Sea, whereas we've seen the Ruthenians want to be left a bit alone, also because they had the upper hand on the northern shores from which grain was exported to the same Constantinople, the fleet of which, the general reach in a broader political sense, was a bit worrying, especially for the Red Ruthenians, as we've seen, a strong Constantinople tries to reassert some level of control on the Danube Delta that is just next door also to the ports that the Galicians have tried to maintain under their control. In fact, after the deaths of both Yaroslav of Kiev and Volodymirko of Halych, this alignment shifted. When Yuri of Suzdal, these are from other places again, but they covered different principalities at the time, that was allied with Manuel Comnenus, that reached as far as that, and captured Kiev itself. Yaroslav, that was the new leader, the Principality of Galicia, as we've seen, adopted a pro-Hungarian stance, because at that point it seemed like he was surrounded. greater Byzantine influence from the sea, on the Danube, even from Suzdal in the northeast, now even seizing Kiev. No, the guy had to be someone else, had to be something else. Otherwise, he would have been overrun. This is mostly like a Ruthenian dynamic, but it's controlled by the same Constantinople. There is also the incident of Andronikos Komnenos that was just one of the most infamous, but also fascinating figures during the Komnenian era. I discussed him in the video about Manuel Komnenos. This was the cousin of the emperor who tried to usurp the throne, as it was the case. Like you don't want to participate to a Komnenian imperial banquet among the family, because you may get your head cut at some point by one of your relatives. True story. It's something that almost happened between these guys. We are in the years 1164-65. This guy had already been arrested by Manuel, etc. He manages to escape captivity in Constantinople. He basically toured all the surroundings of the Byzantine Empire, the different courts, to escape his cousin's grip and prison, including seeking refuge at the court of Yaroslav in Galicia, which was a way to reinforce that anti-Byzantine stance at that point. Naturally, the hope, to some degree, Yaroslav maybe didn't think, but he would bet on, at large, maybe allowing for Andronikos to come back to Constantinople and rise against Manuel, that, however, was a firmly established ruler. So it was more like being unkind to Manuel and signaling his dissatisfaction with his rule. This really presented, by the way, a threat to the Sejm. Andronikos was the same imperial blood. He could actually gain support in this way, not just in Galicia, but also in the neighboring Hungary, that, as we've seen, was enemy to Constantinople, where the imperial authority began to freak out. Manuel, in fact, would ultimately forgive Andronikos and convinced him to come back to Constantinople in 1165. This was in part caused by the same Galician international stand. In fact, a diplomatic mission sent to Kiev at the time of the reign of Prince Rostislav resulted in favorable conditions for the Galicians that essentially used Kiev as a medium also for the relations with Constantinople, up to the promise and provision of Galician forces in Transylvania against the Hungarians on behalf of the Byzantine Empire. Right? In fact, during these negotiations, Yaroslav was convinced by the Kievans in Constantinople to attack into the Hungarian kingdom, to destabilize especially its wide eastern frontier land of Transylvania. We talked about this land. We have to complete the original series for it. In 1200, the Galician power was still aligned with Constantinople. In particular, the Ruthenians and the Byzantines were trying to reduce the Cuman influence in the south of Ruthenia, in order to keep trade between the two countries more fluid, more alive. Naturally, things would change in 4 years. However, the Cuman problem had always been a constant for the Ruthenians. They couldn't simply take them out. Also, they would actually use them as mercenaries by fighting again when they were fighting against one another. But going back to Manuel's strategy against Hungary, you know that in 1166 he carried out this major campaign against Hungary that would go on in fact, with the Battle of Zemplin in the following year, so bringing Hungary de facto on its knees. This was achieved also thanks to the cooperation with Galicia that sent troops into Hungary through the Carpathian Mountains, passing through Bukovina. The Byzantines instead passed from the Wallachian plain, entering Hungary via the Transylvanian Alps in the south. So it's still the Carpathians, but the so-called, like this, the southern part of it. So a southeast attack that actually was very successful and that heavily destabilized the Hungarian presence in Transylvania. That had never been fully firm, but at least Transylvania was technically part of the kingdom of Hungary, not just of the crown, right? It was properly attached to the administrative void of, was essentially 1/3 of the country, even though the Hungarians did not really have much of a direct rule as kings, like they had always sort of some vassals that also mostly ruled into a foreign land of sort. I made multiple videos on the Vlachs, you can check that out, we'll make other stuff soon. Now, we already observed how important in all of this was for the Galicians to regulate their politics through an assembly of freemen. This was not a formally organized civic system, as we could see it in, the cities of the West. Actually, the Eastern European freemen had a sort of authoritarian view of power that they would have seized had they had an individual one themselves, just like these princes were doing. So also stressing the duality between the two philosophies is incorrect. Mostly this was a sort of feudal world, and the reason why the Galician princes were sort of more dependent on the local communities is the fact that they weren't as radically developed as some feudal monarchies in Western Europe, right? Actually, this, on the long run, was in part a source of instability. The freemen actively invited the princes to practice this liberty, meaning, as it was traditional, customary all over Europe, but formally authority that depended on at least the success in dispensing justice, in respecting the pre-existing rights of the locals that had already developed them on their own. It is essentially common law, right? Every community had its own set of customs. This was not also very functional. At large, most Ruthenians were peasants, so this in part does show how, in fact, mostly this is a bit less true for Galicia, if we want to say it all, but we have seen in other videos about Eastern Europe that essentially Ruthenia had the space that was the city that is also a city by, say, size standards of some sort, not because there is a true urbanism in the way we see it in the West, but not just in post-Roman Europe, also in other centers that had been emerging in Central Europe, for example. It's something different, right? And mostly it's detached from the countryside. The countryside is almost on its own. It's very difficult even to manage peasant levies that are also not good for much. It's mostly a dialectic between the prince and this sort of mercantile estate that can mobilize local militias that are decently equipped and trained to support the dynastic cavalry retinues of Druzhina and so on. From one side, this people could even dismiss their governance. We've seen today, and we'll keep seeing today, how essentially different rulers were called at a time. By whom? By these communities, right? Contrary to the wishes of Yaroslav, Osmomysl, who had intended the throne for a younger son, Oleg, for example, the Galician, not just the people per se, because there were always the noblemen, like the establishment in general, chose his brother Volodymyr II Yaroslavich. The reason being sort of sabotaging this dynasty, right? The more these local princes were subjected to the more traditional split of sort of agnatic lineage rather than the one from father to son, the princes were undermining their power. They could have not simply consolidated quicker, more effectively a local autocracy. So the people sort of sabotaged this process that in other parts of Europe successfully brought actually to more advanced systems. Again, the reason why here the princes were more limited is the fact that they could not collect so much surplus. By the way, some legitimately, here we're at the end of the 12th century, like what would happen with Mongol invasion was also a product of the gradual weakening of the same mercantile element, the fact that at large also that establishment had taken on an ever more oligarchic character, and that the fact that there is also nobility of knights, of people that prevent further power concentration, and this does not help the Ruthenians against the Mongols. I made multiple videos about the Mongol invasions, and we have this notion that there was no way fundamentally the Ruthenians could withstand the Mongol invasion. This is not true. Had they been more politically united, more socially compact, they could have really been a problem for the Mongols that, by the way, did subject most of the Rus, but mostly by name, like where the steppes stretch, like you can move as a Mongol army. When the forests begin exactly where the Slavs inhabit the land, you have to watch your back, in the woods, because that's not the best way, the best place where to deploy Mongol cavalry, right? So it's complicated. We will see the Mongol invasion of the Rus better in some other video. In any case, you understand that this is, we've seen it also in the video about the Khmer Rus in general, this is a moment of general destabilization, of general crisis locally. These Ruthenian princes are mostly fighting against one another. In fact, after some wars between Yaroslav Osmomysl and his brother Volodymyr II Yaroslavich, the Galician nobility invited a third claimant, that is Roman Mstislavich the Great, that was the Prince of Volhynia, so just in the north, to take the throne, though he was soon in turn replaced by Andrew, that was the son of the Hungarian King Bela III. This already tells you how, by the way, here the Hungarians had made a comeback, the Byzantines were not faring with the Anglois such a great time. So you understand how Galicia is still somehow a province against regional powers, and so they try to invite this other neighbor, this other Ruthenian that is so close to them, and the rule doesn't hold. The Hungarians take advantage of this political division, and they place, at least it's the local Galicians that decide that, but also after having been pressured by Bela III, Prince Andrew of Hungary. The Galicians had preferred the switch due to the promise of self-governance assured by Bela through his son, right? So the notion was that, we're not invading you as Hungary as a wall with the monarch coming there and trying to literally conquer you and annexate you to the Hungarian crown, which is what the Hungarians technically tried to do at different levels, because in part they would try to expand across the Carpathians. That the same, this brought to the also to the detachment of the same Moldavia later, because some Vlachs had also been displaced by Hungarian expansionism, but also acted on behalf of the Hungarian crown. We've seen this in different videos. So settling there, the Hungarian prince was a great success for Hungary, but from a Galician side, it was like, okay, well, this is not full humiliation, right? He's not literally a guy that rules in Hungary. It's just the Prince of Galicia, because that's how it works in the Middle Ages. You're not a foreign entity that installs itself with foreign, unless you literally can afford to do so. I don't know, when Wales was annexated by England, etc. Here in Eastern Europe, between Central and Eastern Europe, is much more complicated as always. You have just one guy installed there. It was already a big deal per se. In all this, there are internal agitations, because the nobility and the freemen try to sort of keep a degree of order, but the Hungarian retinue of Andrew is pretty nasty, to say the least. And they see this place as, okay, we conquered you, we are the best, you suck. And so there is also some attempt from the papacy to impose Roman Catholicism into Galicia, together with proper rituals and practice. This is what eventually was already opening a bit Galicia to the Roman Church, as they will appeal to it later on when the Mongols arrived. But in the moment, it's not really helpful. In fact, the Galicians are fed up with the Hungarians, and they establish Volodymyr II in Alich, where he ruled until 1199, the year of his death. That is a quite relevant moment, because Volodymyr II Rostislavich was the last descendant of the Principality's original founders. Right, so there was at the end, essentially, of their dynasty, together with the dynastic legitimacy that had stemmed from that for these rulers. This opened, thus, discussions among the Galicians on whom should have just succeeded. Volodymyr's sisters' sons were thought of, in particular the legendary Prince Igor, the guy of his own tale, or say of his own campaign, the poem narrating how he went out in the day crushing enemies, and at night literally as a werewolf, howling to the moon and sucking blood. I made some videos about berserkers, ulfednars, and consider we are in the late 12th century, the beginning of the 13th, so we are really in a world that you must picture, you must understand in ways that normally, I think, pop culture does not, right? What could be in the Slavic world, the legacy of previous tribal warfare and spiritual martiality with that pinch of Varangian mysticism and bloodthirstiness, especially in a time so viciously marked by infighting, feuds, vendettas, and so on. The guy was taught for succession. Again, this equated to fish rulers from more far away Ruthenian principalities that, however, were fairly compact. Again, the elites mostly married into one another. In fact, you see here there is a sister as a medium here from the previous dynasty. So we're talking male lineage as the official one, without which you had to elect somebody else, still, however, connected by blood. Remember that here in theory everybody's part of the Rurikic dynasty, or at least they have Rurikic blood that works for the seniority in Kiev, and etc. Meanwhile, the Prince Roman of Volodymyr, that is, as we've seen, part of the Galician Principality, because there are these other centers, this different lords ruling under the bigger prince, sponsored by foreigners, namely the Prince of Sandomierz, Leszek the White, that would also be the High Duke of Poland, captured Halich despite substantial local resistance. This is very interesting because you see that the Hungarians tried, etc., but at the end of the day, it's the Poles that managed to break through in that direction. We have already talked about the Kingdom of Poland and the southeastern frontier, but you know that historically that was an important vector of expansion, the only sort of viable one, as Ruthenia was sort of softer than Poland, especially at this point. The following 6 years were quite bloody, right? We witnessed the repression of the local nobility and freemen at the hands of the admittedly Ruthenian Roman, however, as a foreign pawn. There is actually an important affirmation of princely autocracy. There is a paradox here. That system that had witnessed the balance between the nobility and freemen is crushed, but the local authority increases. In fact, from Alich, the princely authority extends further up to surpass the one of the same Kiev. Alich is currently the most important center of all the Rus at this point. Of course, in absolute terms, not governing the entire Rus or claiming seniorate, whatever, but these areas, remember, that they're closer to civilization, they are substantially rich, they may have political imbalance, but they have the resources to maintain an important control. More or less during the same period, the Volhynian Principality was merged with Galicia itself, as a consequence also of this dynamic. So that's how the pair Galicia-Volhynia began, also as a principality for the later evolution into a kingdom that we already analyzed again in another video. We'll find it in the top fix comment down below as a link to it. Further successful campaigns against rival claimants to the Galician throne allowed Roman, that having started his career, so to say, sponsored by foreigners, managed from Alich to extend his own influence over the same Kiev, earning thus the nickname of the Great. He was shrewd into placing loyal supporters in the center, in the heart of the Rus, that had all its spiritual supremacy, regardless of the local shortcomings. One of these supporters was endorsed also by Yaroslav III Yurevich, the Grand Prince of Vladimir, witnessing a power-sharing situation over Kiev, because here, again, the Ruthenian Palatinate is really rising in importance historically, but it's not like they can effectively as directly control Kiev itself. First of all, there is always some local establishment, but there are also these other principalities that infest the region and want their own share. Roman continues to consolidate his Galician possessions. He, for example, wages campaigns against the Cumans. It's believed also possibly against the Lithuanians that, as you know, would later take over Ruthenia, stripping it from the Mongols. I made an interview about this last year, but the guys has still been making video less frequently, so maybe this year my interview will come out nevertheless. The Lithuanians were in a particular situation, they were pressured by Teutonic Knights, but they were just bordering Ruthenia. Roman has a great power. He manages to reach as far north. You know that the Lithuanians will be civilized by the Ruthenians, right? There is this peculiarity in which they maintain Lithuanian as a language later on when they take over Ruthenia, but they inherit the Ruthenian script, language, etc. Because for the church, for the letters in general, and this is like one of the amazing cultural influences of the Ruthenian Palatinate on European history, also in other countries. There is originally, in the case of Roman, again, Prince of Galicia, also of Kiev, but the title of Tsar, an autocrator of all Rus. Bear this in mind, because this was already a thing that at large was deeply understood by the Khivans very early on. And the entire story of the Muscovy claiming, for example, also the Patriarchate of Kiev per se, it was all a scam. Like, basically started doing it themselves. The Patriarchate of Constantinople was accomplice to that, but used by the Ottomans as a pawn by the time it happened, because Constantinople had already fallen. This guy was imprisoned, in a quite infamous way, as a record, both by the Muscovy and by the Ottomans, and he acted as a Turkish pawn. In the meanwhile, the Ruthenian Palatinate at the time was already within the Polish, at least Polish dominion, went on simply maintaining its own patriarchate and of the Rus and these higher titles. The Muscovy simply inventing, making up that kind of claim. People, weirdly enough, still believe this in some strange sense. They don't know the ABC of the story. Moscow was never the third Rome, unless you want to style yourself like that for some weird reason. But it was a pretty shady, to say the least, business, and legally wise was not backed by half of Ruthenia. That was on its own, in fact. Now, after Roman's death in 1205, his widow sought assistance from the Hungarian king Andrew II. The problem was that she was essentially the regent and obviously faced great resistance. The Hungarians, she knew pretty well that the Hungarians wanted nothing but annoying the Poles, but operating across the Carpathians is easy for no one. In fact, at this point, 1206, the Galicians called upon Volodymyr III Igorevich of Putinville, that was the son of Yaroslav, Osmomysl's daughter. So remember, there is a connection with the earlier dynasty, to assist Roman's widow and their children in especially fleeing the city at that point. Volodymyr III ruled in Galicia for only a couple of years, really, due to wars with his brother Roman II, who was deposed, allowing Roman to take over the Galician throne. He is, however, in turn expelled by Rostislav II Rurikovich of Kiev. Incredibly complicated stories. We have to follow the entire picture of the Rus, what was going here. It's incredibly messed up. I know very few parallelisms with other, say, equally complicated or comparably complicated political pictures in the Middle Ages. In fact, Roman manages to come back once again on the throne, ousting Rostislav. The Galician establishment is in turmoil and seeks assistance from the Hungarian king, who dispatched his palatine Benedict to Alich. This was a serious matter because even though those rulers were Ruthenian, they were, of course, quite predatory in many ways. They came from other principalities. They were trying to capitalize upon this dynastic sum of possessions, of dominions. But the question was, like, how can you keep this together? You understand, this is on the thresholds of the Mongol invasion. It doesn't look good at all. When the Palatine of Hungary, Benedict, arrives in Alich, the town doesn't like, and they call for Prince Mstislav the Dumb, literally, from Perezovnitsia to take on the throne, but he, in fact, that's where he gained his nickname, was mocked and was sent away. Just think what kind of historical legacy you're going to leave. Maybe, I don't know, he was not dumb, but surely not so capable. The Hungarian Palatine remained there, so that in order to overthrow him, the inhabitants of Alich invite the Igorevich brothers, yet other attempt, that are Volodymyr III and Roman II, which managed to oust Benedict, thereby reclaiming authority over the Principality of Galicia. Volodymyr establishes himself in Alich, Roman II in Zvenigorod, and their third brother, Sviatoslav, in Przemysl. This was a Solomonic choice, similar to the one established at the beginning of the Principality's history, to say, okay, well, we all get our own part, and we'll try to make things work. Which, guess what, they actually don't, right? In fact, this is not even about the brothers themselves, it's about the rest of the Galicians that want to maintain some greater control of their own affairs. They do not like these brothers, and they actually kill all three of them. Just to tell you about the general temper of the time. Dangerous, very dangerous. A young son of Roman the Great, Daniel of Alich, was brought to the throne. After his mother sought to assert her influence as a regent, however, she was expelled from the city. So what do the Halicians do? They called, once again, Mstislav the Dumb, the guy that they had mocked and humiliated, who apparently living up to his fame accepts to make an even worse impression, because at this time he was offered a rule, but he fled Alich before receiving it. There was actually a valid reason, that is to say, the Hungarians were on the horizons and they had been called upon by Daniel's mother to restore their control over Alich. So the guy said, I'm out of here. His reputation was ruined anyway, so who cares? Naturally, at the time, maybe they would have not called him the Dumb, but this is more like a historiographical title. But this is also by how the Ruthenian rulers always go by nicknames, and not always the most specific and precise and accurate depiction of what these characters were. The Hungarians fail. Once again, they try to take over control of the principality, but they go nowhere. To the throne of Alich rises Bolodislav Kormilchich, who was a Galician nobleman. We are in either 1211 or 1213. This is a moment of at least great establishment power on the principality. Some scholars basically point to the greater interaction, like a popular force and nobiliar one, in cooperating for the choice of the prince. It's a bit more shaded, a bit more complicated, but there is no doubt that as a whole, Galicia stands out for a great deal of their popular capacity to elect its rulers at this point. Volodislav's reign was a fragile, weak one, so the general landscape is not that positive. Quite the contrary. In fact, the Galicians stand their ground, but they are eventually overwhelmed by foreign enemies that prey upon this situation of chronic instability. Again, it's not like the Galicians did not have the capacity or the bravery or the determination, but they lacked the political vision and general unity. They were exposed. Like, in many ways, this is the condition of many, if not most, medieval powers, all right? And you have to appreciate how solid, how equilibristically the Principality of, equilibristically capable the Principality of Galicia had been up to this point to actually remain fundamentally autonomous. However, in 1214, the Hungarian ruler Andrew and the Polish prince Leszek decide to jointly take over the Principality of Galicia and partitioning it in spheres of influence. Essentially, the western part would go to Poland, because that was the historical area of greater infiltration. The Hungarians accept this other sort of southern part, that are less developed, but at large are also namely now under recognized international, at least by the Poles, under that crown. Naturally, not even this settlement is fully successful. It's enacted from the Hungarian side by the return of Palatine Benedict, that was deemed to be an expert on Ruthenian affairs by that point. King Andrew's son, Koloman, was crowned by the Pope as King of Galicia. This is very relevant because remember, we are here after the Fourth Crusade. Constantinople has fallen, a Roman Catholic patriarchate has been established, and the fact that these are the only areas that maintain a political autonomy with a Greek Orthodox Church. The demise of the Byzantine Empire in its larger historical form has naturally shrunk the power of the same Rus, of which this Catholic Western neighbors profit. That's how basically like the power shifts in that direction, and there is substantial, at least a decline in the aftermath of the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. The Hungarians can't, however, convince the Galicians to simply pass to the Roman creed. There are some tensions also from the Polish side, so much so that the Galicians managed to expel the Poles in 1215. This brings to the rise of Prince Mstislavich the Bold, that had come from Novgorod, and under his leadership the Galicians become tendentially more autocratic. At least the nobility, as we were saying before, has generally profited from all these destabilizations in relative terms to the rest of the populace, right? That, again, idea of a free popular force that could negotiate the election of the Galician prince with the nobility, by this point is already evaporated, or at least it has fallen drastically. This did not really help the overall Galician stability at all, right? As we know, oligarchic systems just per se tend to fail, to remain backward. This is what essentially the Mongols also caused to a large swath of southeastern Ruthenia, right? Actually, the Palatinate will remain enshrined in a degree of, again, greater development and cultural as spiritual prestige. This is not really irrelevant. This is also true for Kiev at large, because eventually these areas will be connected under a Polish control, but we're talking later times. If anything, the collapse of the popular fabric had undermined part of the Galician militia's capacity to withstand external infiltrations, right? In fact, it seems that the Galician military at this point was disorganized and ineffective. Few powerful people at the top, and a sort of crippled basis. Despite this, Mstislav was in charge, and he had to make things work. It was very difficult. The Galicians did not really like him. As a consequence, he decided to lean in favor of the Hungarian prince. In 1227, Mstislav even allowed his daughter to marry Andrew of Hungary, and bestowed upon them as a couple, authority in Galicia. So essentially on his behalf, in an informal fashion, but still signaling Hungary that at least some help was needed to maintain his regime. Andrew surprisingly earned a favorable reputation among the Galicians, in part probably because they hated Mstislav, but in part also because he was a clever ruler. He took care, also mostly he respected the nobiliar rights. He understood that at this point it was the oligarchy he had to negotiate power with, and by sort of providing them with further prerogatives, but also demanding for something in turn, he managed more or less to rule. As it's predictable here, the thing wouldn't last too long. Even this compromise in 1233, only 6 years later, a faction, at least of the Galicians, because we're talking factions in general, like it wasn't like a univocal, we're talking about the majority, the decisive moral majority of the Galicians, when I say the Galicians here, but there are always different houses, different clans that want something different. They invited Daniel to return. This brings to open warfare with a stand of the Hungarians in Alich that is besieged by Daniel's Ruthenian forces and bringing to the same death of Andrew. This was actually a pretty bloody and serious issue that obviously triggered the Hungarians like never before. Daniel briefly controlled Halich, but he realized that he couldn't simply control it, as he didn't have the moral majority of the population from his side. You understand how bitter this history is, because again, Galicia was so gifted, it had so much resources and potential, but the situation in the Rus was that chaotic that here whoever can tries to seize yet another principality, but not being able to control it for too long. It was still a favorable strategy. I mean, these guys weren't fighting and dying for nothing, right? But it is how critical the situation here is before the Mongols arrive. The Mongols arrived in 1240. So you understand this is the worst condition, that it's all on, let's say here the Mongols haven't done preemptively anything against the Rus yet. So imagine if Ruthenia had stood its ground more cohesively. The Mongols may have had enormous issues. They weren't unstoppable, they weren't the super winners of everything, as they're often depicted, and at last Ruthenia also maintained its own autonomy under their overlordship. Now, in 1235, at the behest of the Galicians, the Prince of Chernihiv visited the northeast of Kiev, very important cultural center, by the way. Michael Volodovich and his son Rostislav Mikhailovich, whose mother was a daughter of Roman the Great and sister of Daniel. There's always some blood relation here shared by the Ruthenian elite, arrived in Alich. These are the same years of the Mongol invasion that takes place in 1240, when Alich fell under Daniel's control because of the major upheaval that had occurred in Kiev. This authority was still ambiguous, but at least the metus hostilis represented by the Mongols helped consolidating his rule. Historic records from the era reference the rise of a local noble named Dobroslav Sudich to the throne as well. We do not have better details, but we understand that Daniel would have been overthrown, faced significant challenges in the control of Galicia. The 40s were a disastrous period, and we'll understand why. In 1241, Halich itself was overrun by the Mongol army. God knows only what that meant, right? We have barely, even in the understanding of the details for Poland and Hungary, but from an archaeological point of view, we're told. And that's rough, right? Admittedly, countries, even like Hungary, recovered early, etc. The Ruthenian Palatinate was also resilient in its own way, but surely the Mongol shadow really obscures quite a lot the future of the entire Ruthenia. By 1245, Daniel secured a pivotal victory against the Hungarian-Polish forces led by Rostislav, successfully reuniting Galicia with Volhynia, showing that in spite of, in fact, this Mongol tempest, Ruthenians' pulse Magyars had not really lost the taste for mutual rivalry. On the contrary, now they were trying to take advantage of the upheaval, because major assets had shifted, had been eliminated, like the balance had to be entirely reestablished. As you know, in Ruthenia, the ultimate winners of this would be the Lithuanians. So that's actually a relatively unexpected move, because, as you know, the Lithuanians were incredibly primitive and savage in many ways, but they managed, for this very reason, to envision the possibility of taking over Ruthenia, and they do it quite successfully. In any case, what happened in 1245 enshrined Daniel with an aura of glory. He had triumphed on both the Hungarians and the Poles, plus defeating his rival Rostislav. In fact, he was so confident that he established his residence in Holm, that is Chelm, in today's Poland, which basically signaled like some capacity of pushing his lordship even further. This shows you how, again, the Ruthenians were well equipped at large. Remember that at the shrinking of popular force, the autocratic one had affirmed. So even though these powers were navigating very perilous waters, that sense of greater Mongol ferocity and strengthening of cavalry forces does play a role here. The Ruthenians managed to score this important victory and to assert themselves a bit more with iron fist within that as a local princely rule with their own territory, and keeping a bit out the others. Holm, by the way, is in Volhynia, right in the western part of. By the way, Daniel at this point manages to secure his position because he obtains essentially the protection of the Golden Horde. In fact, he went himself over to Batu Khan's court. The ruler was the founder of the same Golden Horde there, son of Yochi and the grandson of Genghis Khan himself. He demanded Daniel tribute to him in exchange for Mongol protection, which to an extent came. I mean, the Mongols were quite predatory and they weren't really agreeing to anything that wasn't actually benefiting them. But at large, when you look at, especially at these lands in Galicia, you realize that they were the westernmost ones. So that not even the Mongols could technically always, say, have an enormous leverage on them. Remember, the Mongols controlled the steppes at the end of the day. They settled down in the steppe. The forested Slavic world remains controlled, but in a decentralized fashion, in a direct fashion. We've seen here basically the story of the kingdom also starts, so you can start watching it. The other video I made on the kingdom of Galicia, Volhynia, right? With the Mongol era, everything changes because, again, of the general shift, especially in political and social balance within the same principalities that are much more similar now to this steppe autocratic model than anything. Like Eastern Europe had always maintained a bit of that from the Turco-Mongol influence, but this was really a different world. This was the moment in which Eastern Europe is properly born, the Mongol invasion. Otherwise, up to that point, there was a great similarity with Central Europe. Really a great, and especially a great connection with the West. Always remember this, that the Rus was incredibly connected with the West, much more than we think. We have this notion that we're all sort of Byzantine, or that for them, like the connection with Constantinople, also from a religious point of view, meant so much. Of course, it had been incredibly important for the development of their own states, but it's not like they were particularly fond of those either, just per se. They had very strong relations with the West from a very long time, right? There are very interesting anecdotes, but West Francia, East Francia, the Ottonians, they had very strong relations with Ruthenia, and especially the Palatinate, that really takes the name after the fact that there were such prestigious lands, and they were a bit like the gateway between East, say, and West, at least in Christian terms, were very important. There is all the history of the Uniate Church, or Uniate Church, that I discussed. Also, maybe it is about Ukrainian history. So there's a lot there when you realize how how truly Central European these countries are in the westernmost part, but also how much connected with especially Central Europe historically were up to incredibly recent in time. Everything changes in your mind. It's just like a switch. You understand why certain things happen in the world, because certain connections are not made up. They are truly secular, almost millenary. During the rule of Daniel, Galicia came under the control of his eldest son, Leo I, who held the titles of King of Ruthenia and Prince of Belts from 1245 to 1264, and later governed Peremysl and Galicia from 1264 to 1269, even Kiev from 1271 to 1301. Other very important aspect we already highlighted, the Palatinate was connected with Kiev to a big degree, and that's really the part of the Rus that inherits the moral, the political, the cultural prestige of the old the Grand Principality, right? So this is never to be forgotten. There is an entire part of the Rus that remain always on its own and was not really brought under other Ruthenian principalities. It was not as part of the previous system, as you've seen, of power sharing, mostly gravitating around Kiev anyway. When Daniel died, Leo gradually strengthened his authority over all parts of Volhynia as well, so consolidating this duo of Galicia and Volhynia, one above the other. The latter half of the 13th century witnesses the enhancement of the central bit that, as you know, is today the capital of Galicia, that emerges quite strategically as a new political and administrative hub near Zvenigorod, located essentially at the border with Volhynia, right? So north of Alich, as a bridge between the two lands. Around the beginning of the 14th century, Leo himself took control of Kiev, like his father. They were the elected rulers of the Rus by prestige at this point. That's why I insist very much on that. Even if we follow just the Galician side of the story, these guys were always looking upon Kiev, because just the prestige of the patriarchate, the location of the central church of all the Rus, the seniorate of over, in fact, the entire region stemmed from there. And it was controlled in any case, even when it was a symbolic thing, or at least something depleted compared to the previous times, the golden age of Kiev, by the Palatinate, by the Galicians. The Golden Horde still sort of supervised all this. This is true for all other territories, such as also Moscow, Vladimir, etc. When Leo died, the center of the united Galician Volhynian state returned to Volodymyr. By the way, Lviv was yet to sort of take off in historical terms, but it had been established. Later, what you witness really is the reinforcement of the aristocratic establishment of Galicia. Dmitro Detko was recognized as Lord of Ruthenia from 1340 or 1323, we don't know, but surely up to 1349, and especially from 1341 to 1349 in Galicia as well. He is important here because he's a boyar from Galicia. We don't know exactly what he was, like we think he may have been one of the sons of Yuri I of Ruthenia. He ruled nominally under Prince Lyubartas, who was the Prince of Lutsk. That is another center of Volhynia, and Lyubar from 1323 to 1383, Prince of Zhytomyr from 1363 to 1374, and Grand Prince of both Volhynia and Alich Volhynia from, in fact, 1340-41 to 49. This is interesting because it tells you the degree also of exhaustion apparently that Ruthenia had undergone for a single ruler to gain so much power, especially in the southwest, but also how relatively accidental this rise to power really was, and mostly because there was an oligarchy now that was deciding that there is a guy that can have the control over this areas, but there is no antagonism with the local communities, the free people that have been exhausted at large, and so everything has claritized in an oligarchy, whereby without these magnates you can't rule, and so if they elect you, what do? Right? There may be one that does not accept your rule, you have to fight with the support of the other oligarchs against them, but it's not such an unstable system paradoxically as before, except the forces that agitated within also in terms of autonomy and further growth are exhausted. Here we're talking about the years of the Black Death. The entire Eurasian system is collapsing. Dmytro dies in the same 1349. At this point, the Poles make another move. We've seen it in the video about Casimir the Great, who advanced on the same Lviv, also forging alliances and therefore a situation of power sharing over Galicia-Volhynia with the Golden Horde and the Kingdom of Hungary. Again, here the Lithuanians still have to swarm across the entire system and taking over everything. You understand, in fact, these other powers, doesn't matter how strong they are, they simply can't control this place directly. They need all these kind of agreements. It's never settled, and this is also very interesting, right? Because at large, this depended on the local population as well. So there is some important, say, autonomy, some important capacity from the oligarchy, especially to maintain some important power. And the territory is quite complex. By the way, the Vlachs are descending from the Carpathians. In larger parts, they're sort of in between Galicia and the Black Sea. Consider that the Black Death had actually weakened a bit everybody, except Poland. Poland didn't have much Black Death for some reason. In fact, that's why here you see them having the lion's share in a sense, but still not managing. This southeastern frontier of Poland was again more difficult to control, to simply consolidate a stronger power, but they infiltrate more. But for Hungary, it's become very difficult to reach east of the Carpathians, like before the Black Death. Right? For them, it's already a big deal if they can't control Transylvania effectively. So there is also in Galicia form of territorialization of power that after the Black Death sort of divides more neatly the boundaries with the other places. And if anything, you can have power sharing, but mostly as a sort of rule floating over these lands that at large do maintain their own reality. And again, this is a time in history in which everything slows down historically, also especially in Central Eastern Europe. What you see here, foundational, is what you see up to the 20th century. It's beautiful to think about this also because Galicia and Volhynia are beautiful. When you look at it in hindsight, however, the actions of Casimir the Great bring to the final subjugation of Galicia to the Polish crown, so that in a way or another, regardless of the autonomy, this world decides that they are under that power. Poland is again particularly strong, it's actually reviving in power, and at large will have an easy access to Galicia. In 1387, all territories of the Galician Principality had been absorbed into the holdings of the Polish Queen Jadwiga, and in 1434 they were reorganized into the Ruthenian Voivodeship that was part, in fact, of the Polish crown. We will see this entity because it does have a significant role historically. By the way, and I made a video about this, Galicia, with the partitions of Poland, will end up in the hands of the Habsburgs, where the political affirmation international stage of the modern Ukrainian national identity was fostered to the point of spilling over, eventually taking over everything also in the east, while Kiev, Chernihiv, etc. were under the Tsarist empire. So not even that long ago, it's actually a particularly short time. Some parts of Ukraine were not even a century ever under Moscow's control, especially these ones, as a matter of fact. So here you have, again, an extraordinary culture, general literary advancement. Of course, there are influences from Poland that is more culturally advanced, but at large, like for example with Lithuania, because originally at least most of Lithuania drew from the Rus, not from, and specifically from these areas, not from Poland. You have probably the information of very strong Central European and Eastern European reality that fundamentally has an enormous cultural legacy in European identity. We have seen it in those videos. Galicia will become, under the Habsburgs, the Kingdom of Galician Ludomeria, and that would be Volhynia, as Lviv with its administrative center. We also observe all the splits, like who was who in the city, in the countryside, the Poles, the Jews, the Ukrainians. This would create, again, enormous ethnic tension during the 20th century, but just also because of some particular fuel, especially, it's always the Soviets' fault in many ways, but there is also a lot of, difficulties going on for re-establishing a Ukrainian state. Even with this enormous Ukrainian population, the Galician Principality has also a long history of connection with the Byzantine Empire. Today we discussed a little bit. There are different chances of this. For example, not even Kiev was that connected with Constantinople as the Galician Principality at some point. Irina, the daughter of Volodar of Przemysl, that in Ruthenian is actually Peremysl, was married in 1104 to Isaac Comnenus, that was the third son of the Emperor Alexius I. I made a video about him, by the way. Their son would be the future Emperor Andronicus I, right? As we've seen, spent also times in Alich and ruled various cities within the Principality, because they had been handed over to him in a third general regard between 1164 and 65. Again, brief empire he would have, quite bloodily ending, but this is really relevant also as far as his ancestors. We know from, for example, Ptolemy of Lucca, an important bishop and historian of the late 13th century, beginning of the 14th, that the Byzantine Emperor Alexius III would seek refuge in Alich after the fall of Constantinople in 1204. This is important because it shows also the opportunities that Galicia thought to have when, as a sort of recipient of the Byzantine legacy after the Crusader conquest of the empire and establishing of the Latin Empire of Romania. Right, the Cumans were also a common enemy between the Byzantines and the Ruthenians, but at large also were mostly the latter's problem from a territorial point of view. The Byzantines, in any case, took a lot of Cumans in their army, as we've seen in many videos, and we will also have to see once again, because they tended to raid, and that was the problem, to raid into like the Bruja, the Danubian Valley in general. So if you're interested in how the story went, like look at this sort of the kingdom of Galicia Volhynia, because there you will find the general, say, articulation of also this, the the fame of the Ruthenian Palatinate and why it's so important. And there is that series on Ukraine that you can look at, because it's such like no person normally knows these things, because people don't study anything, don't know anything, they never did, and at large never will. But it's literally manual history of, say, the places everywhere, except perhaps in Moscow, but that's another story. We're talking real history, as we always wrote this, and nobody ever denied even the existence of Ukraine historiographically. But we'll talk more about this history, because I think it's really fascinating, especially for medieval times. Just to stick to the timeline, really have this enormous intertwinement, this attempt to really consolidate something greater. Initially, there is this greater drive from Kiev, and this manages to keep things really together for long. But also there is this notion that this legacy is so important and everybody wants to battle for it, and especially when these other principalities, like the Galician one, consolidate, as we've seen today, there is a pretty consistent amount of interest, of wealth involved, and even the capacity of shifting cultural centers to some extent. But a direction that takes actually a Western path, which is also the greatly forgotten thing. These lands were incredibly close to the West, were basically West, especially when they actually converted to Roman Catholicism in order to escape the Mongolian pressure. This is what really went on. There were negotiations with Rome. Everything was, in a sense, positively handled, because of course the Saint Ruthenians did not like the Mongols very much. But there is also this specific regional dimension here, even within the same Rus. Right, the Rus was not just one thing, and especially in the beginnings, like that is even more evident. Right, the way this system could be molded was from a necessarily greater force in the south, that in fact was the more viable location of power, and it would remain more tied to the west for this very reason. And that basically is still there if you really want to see it in historical perspective. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.